Gray and purple smoke is billowing up from the Caen area. The results of this visual bombing attack are really terrific. Hundreds upon hundreds of pounds of bombs are raining down on this stricken town, and still the bombers come pouring in. There seems to be no end to them. This is an attack in a big way.
I think he was a great president. I did not always agree with his policies, but I thought that in terms of his accomplishment, after all, when he took over, we were in desperate straits. It was right after that terrible depression. He turned the country around. I think he was an inspired leader. He did lead us to victory in that war. We were on the brink of victory when he died. And since that time, there have been facets of greatness about the presidents who succeeded him. Truman had moments of it. Johnson even had moments of it. But I think they all suffer by comparison with FDR.
Tuesday, July 4th, 1944. It's been 29 days since the Allies first stormed the beaches of Normandy. They've continued to slowly push inland, but the battle for control of the Seine has raged onward. CBS is there with up-to-the-minute news.
World News Today, brought to you by Admiral Corporation in behalf of distributors and dealers all over America and in many foreign lands. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations and leading news centers of our own country, CBS reporters are waiting to bring you first-hand news from the world's political and battlefronts. Now, here's Douglas Edwards.
British troops in Normandy continue to maintain their lines in the Caen sector despite a series of German counterattacks. In Russia, the Germans are falling back on Minsk, and Moscow dispatches say enemy troops are disorganized and are often losing their bearings in the retreat.
On Saturday, July 1st, a counterattack by the German Panzer Corps failed to dislodge the British Second Army around Seine.
3 French columns are converging on Siena.
When OB West Gerd von Rundstedt phoned Berlin to report the failure, Chief of Staff Wilhelm Keitel asked, "What shall we do?" Rundstedt replied, "Make peace, you fools." He was fired the next day.
At the entrance to the Gulf of Bothnia between Sweden and Finland, but Swedish authorities profess to have no knowledge of such a move, and the Finns have denied it.
Meanwhile, the U.S. 133rd Infantry Regiment captured Cecina in Tuscany, Italy. They'd enter Siena on Monday the 3rd.
That all communication with the city has been blocked.
At the same time, Allies and Japanese forces began battling in New Guinea, and the Battle of Imphal in India ended in an Allied victory.
There has been an ominous quiet on the British sector of the beachhead today, the kind of silence that shrieks of big events to come. It is quieter down on the front today than any time I've heard it since we invaded France. There was only an occasional shell or mortar from the enemy, and there was only spotted shelling from the British batteries. Incidentally, the Germans have an extremely difficult time in using their guns and mortars. Every time they open up, special locating devices spot them, and the British counter-battery fire is terrific. The hundreds of pounds of hot steel that answer even the fire of one mortar must have the Nazis thinking twice before they fire even a revolver in our direction.
On the morning of the 4th, Minsk, the last big German stronghold on Soviet soil, finally fell. This kind of war created a need for fast news relays, so much so that for the first time, news was being recorded on the battlefront.
Now for an interview with the Navy officer who was in charge of the combat recording setup in the invasion, Admiral takes you to CBS Washington. Don Pryor reporting.
First, the news from Washington. Norman H. Davis, National Chairman of the American Red Cross and a veteran of world diplomacy during the terms of 5 presidents, died suddenly this morning at Hot Springs, Virginia. Representative Rundstedt of Georgia, the House Democratic whip, announced today that leaders of both parties in Congress have agreed to call a holiday on controversial legislation until after Labor Day. The plan is for congressional leaders to return on the 1st of August and then to adjourn until after Labor Day, or merely to keep renewing a series of 3-day recesses. The idea is to give congressmen a chance to get back home and mend their political fences. A young freshman senator who has been coming up fast in Democratic political councils has been picked to be the permanent chairman of the Democratic Convention, which meets in Chicago 2 weeks from next Wednesday. He is Samuel D. Jackson of Fort Wayne, Indiana. On D-Day and during the critical days that followed, You had the better front row seat at the making of history than anybody has ever had before, and this is why. When the invasion ships left England, 4 American radio reporters went along, each with an engineer and a film recording machine furnished by the Navy. In the height of battle, these reporters described the action as it happened, and their words and the sounds of war were recorded on a tiny roll of film. You heard those recordings by short wave from London within a few hours after the time they were made. Nothing like such fast eyewitness reporting of war has ever been known before. So to tell you the story behind this invasion reporting, here is Lieutenant Marvin Royston, USNR, who just came back from London. He's an engineer in the radio section of the Navy's Office of Public Relations. He knows that almost human little gadget, the film recorder, very intimately, because he's been working with it for a long time. Isn't that right, Marvin?
Yes, Don, since last September.
Was the invasion the first real trial of the recorder?
No, Lieutenant Commander Dillon and I tried it out last year. We made a cruise on an aircraft carrier in the Atlantic, and he made the first combat recordings then.
Well, what was your job in London?
There I trained the network engineers in the use of the recorder, and the radio reporters too, for that matter. In case of an engineer was wounded, the reporter could have gone right on and run the machine for himself.
Well, how many recorders did you have over there?
We had 16. I assigned 2 of them to each of the network teams, and I had 8 others for broadcasting, dubbing, censorship, and all that.
Well, tell me, how was the film handled? Take Columbia's Charles Collingwood, for instance. He was out on an LCVP over at the beachhead. He described what was going on, and his description was recorded on film. What then?
Well, he would call a dispatch boat, which rushed the film back to England. It was picked up at the dock and hurried to London by motorcycle and sometimes by airplane. We had our control room right in the Ministry of Information. The censors were right there to listen to it, and we dubbed out everything that violated security rules.
What do you mean by dubbing?
Well, I'm afraid that's a little too complicated to explain on the air. It's just the way we eliminate things from a recording and or put things into it.
Okay, we won't go into that. How about your trip that you made with Ed Murrow, CBS's correspondent in London?
Well, I wanted to see some of the show instead of staying at headquarters all the time. So I went with Ed Murrow as his engineer. At first, we were going to fly over the beachhead, but the plane blew out a tire, and we missed that mission. When we finally got into the air, our orders were to bomb launching platforms for the robot planes up near Calais.
Well, now that your film recorders have worked out so well in the big test, what's the plan for the future? There's still a lot of the war to cover.
Yes, and the Navy is going to do everything humanly possible to help you radio reporters cover it. I believe the recordings will be used more extensively right along. As I understand it, CBS is getting some of the gear for its own use. And right now the Navy is working out its plans for very extensive coverage in the Pacific.
It sounds like something pretty exciting. Maybe I could talk the boss into letting me go out there and look around and try out your fine little gadget. I'll return you now to Admiral in New York.
On Independence Day 1944, needing to push further inland from Normandy, the task fell to the 79th and 90th Divisions, as well as the 82nd Airborne, all of whom had to assault uphill and around a large marsh in the low ground, while 12 Nazi divisions lay in wait, including several panzer units. The troops fought yard by yard, making slow but steady progress at a high cost. The 90th Division alone lost over 500 men that day.
And now once again, here is Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral.
With a great amount of publicity being given to frequency modulation, television, and numerous other new ideas in radio, you're probably wondering if tomorrow's peacetime radio will bear any resemblance to your present set. Admiral Corporation has been a leader in research in television, radar, and FM. But we can tell you that many of the practical features of the pre-war Admiral will be retained. One of these is the Admiral Aeroscope.
This same day, General Omar Bradley had artillery units in the U.S. First Army open fire on the German lines precisely at noon. Some units fired red, white, and blue smoke shells at the Germans. The message was clear. The Americans were in Western Europe, and they weren't leaving until victory was achieved.
Yes, you can expect many new ideas in your post-war Admiral, along with the best of the pre-war features that made Admiral the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonographs with automatic record changers. War costs money, a lot of money. The goal of the Fifth War Loan is $16 billion. This means an average of at least a
Welcome to Breaking Walls, episode 153. My name is James Scully. Tonight on Breaking Walls, we'll spend Independence Day 1944 with a home front eagerly pushing towards American victory in World War II. If this is your first time listening to Breaking Walls, welcome to the show. You can find this series on every podcasting platform and at thewallbreakers.com. There is no theme song tonight, in honor of the many brave lives that were lost on Independence Day 1944. Support Breaking Walls at patreon.com/thewallbreakers, and subscribe everywhere you get a podcast, especially YouTube, at youtube.com/@thewallbreakersllc. Join the Breaking Walls Facebook group to keep in touch with news, snippets, photos, and other additions to the podcast at facebook.com/group/thewallbreakers. And the first 8 chapters of Burning Gotham are out everywhere you can get a podcast, and at burninggotham.com. It was a 2022 Tribeca Film Festival audio selection.
When I first got into radio, there were people who were interested in getting the best work out of their artists, and they gave them a lot of liberty. For example, when CBS came to me and said, would you have a ready for the night of victory in Europe, VE Day, World War II? Would you have an hour ready for that night? And I said, yes, I'll begin work on it now, because that day seemed imminent at the time. And they never said to me 2 weeks later, how's it coming? Can we see the first scene? Can we see the first 20 minutes of this? They never asked what I was doing. They trusted me. I was not alone in that bounty. Many of the people who worked for that network at that time were the beneficiaries of that policy. And giving an artist freedom to experiment, to answer the call of his own particular skill, to listen to and to follow his own drummer, as Thoreau said. That's very important.
The man you just heard was Norman Lewis Corwin. He was born on May 3, 1910 in Boston, Massachusetts. The third of 4 children, his mother Rose was a homemaker, and his father Samuel, a printer. Norman graduated from Winthrop High School, but unlike his brothers, he did not attend college. Instead, he got a job at the Greenfield Reporter as a cub newsman at 17. Corwin was later hired by the Springfield Republican, where he worked as an editor. He became known for his column Radiosyncrasies. His first exposure to professional radio broadcasting came with an opportunity to air an interview regarding one of the human interest stories he'd written. Station WBZA soon needed a newsreader and sought to have the position filled with someone from the local paper. Corwin got the job.
I went right out of high school into a job as a reporter on a daily newspaper. I learned how to research my material, how to organize it, and how to make it ready for publication. And then I became a newscaster in the early days of radio. The Westinghouse stations that were synchronized in Boston and Springfield, Massachusetts, asked the newspaper for which I was working if we would give them 15 minutes of news every evening, and I was nominated to do that for the newspaper. So I worked as a reporter by day, and I was a newscaster by night.
By 1929, Corwin fashioned his own broadcast over WBZA, a combination of piano interludes interwoven with Corwin's original poetry readings. He called the program Rhymes and Cadences. In 1931, he traveled to Europe with his older brother, witnessing the growing fascism, social and religious unrest, and political turmoil. It helped shape his broadcasting career. In June 1935, he went to Cincinnati to work for WLW. He soon learned that any on-air reportage of collective bargaining efforts were grounds for immediate dismissal. Objecting, he was fired. Eventually, he got the ACLU's backing and got the policy changed. Corwin came to New York, finding work as a publicist for 20th Century Fox. He soon proposed a poetry and music program for WQXR. The program was called Poetic License, and it wasn't long before NBC and CBS took notice.
Through a series of serendipities, somebody at CBS heard me and thought that I would be an interesting addition to their staff. And they engaged me as a director, not knowing that my chief interest was writing. And so I parlayed those talents and became my own producer as well. When I went to CBS as a director, I began, for the first few months, I directed the work of other people. Mm-hmm. I did some adaptations, a very minor character, more or less learned the network console. And in very short time, I was able to latch on to some opportunities that found my programs getting attention in the national publications, Time and other magazines, and there I was, on my way.
A few days shy of his 28th birthday in 1938, CBS hired Corwin as a director for $125 per week. Within a few months, he directed his first Columbia Workshop experimental drama, The Red Badge of Courage, airing July 9th, 1938. On the night of Sunday, October 30th, 1938, Corwin was rehearsing the pilot for a new program, Words Without Music. Downstairs, Orson Welles was broadcasting his infamous Mercury Theater War of the Worlds.
This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen. Out of character, to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo. Starting now, we couldn't soap all your windows and steal all your garden gates by tomorrow night, so we did the best next thing. We annihilated the world before your very ears and utterly destroyed the CBS. You will be relieved, I hope, to learn that we didn't mean it, and that both institutions are still open for business. So goodbye, everybody, and remember, please, for the next day or so, the terrible lesson you learned tonight. That grinning, glowing, globular invader of your living room is an inhabitant of the pumpkin patch, and if your doorbell rings and nobody's there, that was no Martian, it's Halloween.
What did you think about the War of the Worlds show? You were not involved in that in any way.
No, I was not involved in it, except that I was in the studio right underneath the one from which that show was sent out. I knew nothing about it until after my show went off the air.
Dorothy Thompson said it was nothing credible about the show at all. You've no doubt heard the show or heard transcriptions of the show.
Yes.
What do you think of it today, 40 years later?
Well, it's vintage radio. I don't think anybody would be fooled by it today. But it did demonstrate, in the first place, radio shares the proscenium with television. I think that the tendency today would be to leap from your radio set to your TV set to see what it looks like. And so that would be most unlikely to happen. And also there are certain radio conventions that are now different. But it certainly was a ringing demonstration of the power of that medium.
Corwin's Words Without Music began airing a month later. He was soon writing as well as directing and producing his own shows. On Christmas Day, 1938, he broadcast the famous Plot to Overthrow Santa Claus from CBS's flagship WABC in New York.
I had met Murrow shortly after I joined CBS late in 1938, and the circumstances of my meeting him were unforgettable. The very first script that I wrote for radio, as distinct from scripts that I adapted from the work of others. The first original script I wrote was a little comedy fantasy, rhymed all the way through, called The Plot to Overthrow Christmas. Mm-hmm. And the day after the broadcast, I was in my office at CBS when there was a knock on the door, and in came a handsome man with a cigarette in his mouth, and he introduced himself as Edward R. Murrow. And he said he was over from London for just a few days, and that he had happened to tune in my program the previous evening, and he wanted to look me up and, tell me how much he liked the program. Well, that started a friendship which lasted until his death. I was very fond of him.
Did you hear about the plot to overthrow Christmas? Well, gather ye now from Maine to the Isthmus of Panama, and listen to the story of the utter inglory of some gory goings-on in hell. Now, it happened in Hades, ladies and gentlemen, it happened down there that the fiends held a meeting. The fiends held a meeting for the purpose of defeating Christmas. With the aid of a fade on the radio, we'll take you there with a hi and a hey-de-ho to hear firsthand the brewing of the plot down in the deepest Stygian grot.
Grot is a poetical term for grotto. Whenever you hear my voce sotto, or sotto voce, whichever you prefer, it's just I taking pains to make quite sure that nobody makes a poetical allusion which might in any way create confusion. I return you now to the voice you were hearing before I had to do this interfering.
As I was saying, in this Stygian grot, the notables of Limbo hatched a plot.
When you were writing, did you find that once you had that spine, that the rest of it came quickly?
It depended on the nature of the writing. If the idiom were one in which I used heightened language, so to speak, vernacular but with overtones, then the writing was not that easy. If it were vernacular writing, such as in some of the comedies, in The Odyssey of Runyon Jones or in My Client Curly, that came along much more quickly. And then you mentioned The Plot to Overthrow Christmas and The Undecided Molecule. Those two programs were written entirely in verse. And curiously enough, those came quickly because they're both light, they're comedy fantasies, and there's a kind of insouciance about rhyming partners that Mr. Ogden Nash discovered when he was writing. A line kind of welcomes and challenges you to find the rhyming partner, and sometimes that takes you on a merry little chase.
One of Corwin's next memorable plays was They Fly Through the Air with the Greatest of Ease.
Assume it is morning. You know what mornings are. You have seen thousands of them. They rise out of the east, huge as the universe, and stand in the sky till noon. Oh, you've seen all kinds of them. Their coming and their going is cosmic business, yet casual and common and taken all for granted, having to do with milk trains and cock crows and street lamps going out and alarm clocks. All right, so it is morning. It is morning on a level field, still wet with dew. A field once used for haying, flown over at one time by birds going north, or birds going south to build homes. A meadow mowed upon by men, buzzed in by bees.
I did a program called They Fly Through the Air. The second, The Plot to Overthrow Christmas was the very first script I wrote. And The Fly Through the Air was the second. I got a letter from a man I didn't know who was driving on a highway when that program went on. The program ends with the attack on a bombing plane that has just destroyed a civilian target. And he's attacked by a fighter plane and is shot down. And the descent of that plane is described by the narrator. And the man said that he was so emotionally affected while driving that he had to pull off the road, and listen to it with the car not in motion. So, that is a minuscule detail, but you magnify that by millions and you get the panic that swept across this country.
By 1940, Corwin tried his hand in scriptwriting for RKO. Unhappy, he returned to CBS and was given control of the Columbia Workshop for 26 consecutive weeks in 1941.
I was a brash young man. I took on things that, as I look back on it today, I'm amazed that I had the cheek to tackle what I did do. For example, when Bill Lewis, who was then vice president in charge of programs at CBS, said to me one day, "How would you like to take over the Columbia Workshop for 26 weeks and write, direct, and produce that many originals in that many weeks?" I said, "Sure." And, of course, I went home from that meeting and thought, what have I said? What have I committed myself to? But then, in the day-to-day pressure of filling that assignment, there was little time for the shakes. I applied myself and did it with, I must say, with a great deal of sense of adventure and enjoyment. I loved it. It was hard work. There were many nights when I worked right through the night, but I was ready for it, and I had to sacrifice everything that resembled a social life or personal life. I went to no movies, I went to no plays. I was then not married, and I didn't even have dates. I just lived like some monk in a monastery without even a man coming in to Xerox my manuscripts, as in that TV commercial. I had very little lead time, which was a big mistake. That I got through the series as well as I did without flopping was the miracle. But what would happen is that when I finished a program, they were on Sunday nights, and I think they got off around 10:30. They went from 10 to 10:30 p.m. in the East. I would drive home wondering what I was going to do for next week. I would then start the next morning working on next week's program. If by Tuesday it wasn't coming, I abandoned it and hastily went to something else. I just could not afford to struggle too long with a subject that was refractory and that just was not coming. And, of course, in those days, the programs, the productions were put on live. We did not have the option of tape, so that broadcast, if you had a fluff, if an actor fluffed or something went wrong in the studio, that mistake was in Kansas City or Denver before I heard it in the control room in New York.
These plays are today known as 26 by Corwin. They range from whimsy to romance to high drama to coming-of-age tales. CBS refused to offer the series for sponsorship. Corwin's programs weren't about revenue. They were about advancing the medium itself.
They indeed looked upon it as prestige material, if I may say that without seeming immodest. At that time, the network had sections of its weekly schedule reserved from sale. That was their phrase, indeed, reserved from sale. They said, these are our house programs, and we're proud of them, and we don't intend to sell them. That all changed later, of course, as competition among the networks became fiercer, and the economic considerations became heavier. But at that time, it was one of the most luminous aspects of the golden age, that freedom did exist. It didn't last long, but there was that period.
That November 9th, Corwin penned a play called Psalm for a Dark Year. It was an observance of Thanksgiving in a troubled world.
Sons of men, daughters of the mingled lovers of the many tribes who make us what we are. Brothers, sisters by the millions, sitting with us at this table, encircled round us through the far, wide-spreading states. What year this is, we shall not soon forget. Remark it, each of you belonging to it. This year shall skulk among the blackest annals ever, pitied, wondered on, and sung about as long as our posterity looks back to see the how and why of what has gone before. None of us makes pretense to himself of tranquil temper. There are no barefoot pleasures in these hobnailed times. The world is burning. It is burning. Flame is never subtle in its ways. It has a pattern all can recognize. We smell the smoke and feel the scorching air and see the embers snatched up by the winds and blown this way and that. But we are thankful in this graceless year for the strong joy of the challenge, for defiance in the nostril and the weapon in the hand. Shall we despair, who've suckled freedom on the brew of vintages of wrath? Shall we be thankless for the passions stirring in our blood, the love of country, of each spine of cactus and each particle of mist? Shall we be thankless for the way we walk, fearlessly, not stealing glances backward, for the way we talk, for scorn and laughter and the clenching of the fist? Come, Americans, come now, and praise the broken bread together, and the fiddle, and the tilling of the land, the bellboy by the shoals, and Joe, the wild boy, getting married to Louise. Praise now October and the Song of Songs together, praise the men who never shall forget. The steel mills working through the night. The rifle factory. The weapon in the hand. Arise now and give thanks where thanks are due.
Less than a month later, the U.S. was finally thrust into World War II. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor and Manila on December 7th, Corwin penned a play in honor of the 150th anniversary of the Bill of Rights. It was at the behest of President Roosevelt. The play was called We Hold These Truths and broadcast on December 15th. Simultaneously heard on all 4 networks, 60 million tuned in. It was at that time the largest rating share of any dramatic program ever.
How much of that can be ascribed to Paley?
I think that, after all, Paley was the boss. He could have called that off. He could have said, wait a minute, we're being too liberal. But he didn't. The man from whom I benefited most was a man named William B. Lewis, vice president in charge of programs when I joined CBS. He exerted that influence on the network. Paley accommodated that. In those days, the network was more or less a family affair. It was not the giant that it is today, the diversified giant. So one did see a good deal of Paley. He came around one evening with his wife and sat in the control room while I did a program. And when I was in England doing the American in England series, one time he was visiting London and said, how would you like to come out with me to an airdrome? The British are going to take off on a raid over Germany, and we've been invited to see the flyers take off, and we'll stay around until they return. And I went with him. Well, you know, that's a wonderful kind of a boss to work for.
Sure it is. I think it was Ed Murrow who said just before he died, you know, when I started at CBS, there was one boss, and now there are 50 vice presidents.
Right.
That was in the 60s. I don't know what there would be today.
Yeah.
It seemed like CBS, had somebody in the right position at that time in almost every area. I mean, they had Mr. Lewis here, and then they had Paul White working in news. It was a pretty predominant network at that time, wasn't
it? Yes, it was. That was the time of Ed Murrow and Bob Trout and Charlie Collingwood.
Do you think 55 representatives of the American people sat in a hall in New York City, in a drafty hall, and made up Articles of Freedom? Do you think the congressmen from 13 states made up those freedoms out of their own heads, debated there, deliberated there, without assistance, all by themselves, from their own experience? Oh, no. They had much help from many nameless and unknown, from dust in quiet places, from broken bones deep in the earth, deep in forgotten earth, mixed with the empty clay, from bleeding mouths, burnt flesh, cropped ears, from numberless and nameless agonies. The delegates from dungeons, they were there.
I said that men were born equal. That is all I said.
The delegates from ashes, at the bottoms of the stakes, they were there.
The king did not approve.
The gallows delegates, whose corpses lifted gently in the breeze, they too.
We too.
The exiled wanderers, the Christians killed for being Christians, Jews for being Jews, the Quakers hanged in Boston town. They made a quorum also.
Prison. We are prison.
The murdered men, the lopped off hands, the shattered limbs, the red welts where the whiplash bit into the back. Must you know what they said? Must you know how they argued? Must you be told the evidence, the silent testimony of the raid? Must it be told verbatim? Listen then! That was an argument for an amendment. That was a speech in favor of an article of freedom. That prayed the passage of a Bill of Rights. How much of all this must be told to be believed? Must it be drawn on diagrams? X marks the spot where decency was last observed. The dotted line shows how the victim staggered. The arrow points to blood. The headsman, he was there in Federal Hall. The man who turned the ratchets on the rack. He sat in the assembly, too. Nero was there. Caligula, King Philip, Torquemada, Cotton Mather, all the tyrants and the martyrs who had gone before, sat quietly, unseen among the representatives, read from their memoirs, expert testimonies, found their ways into the records and between the lines. All the long and bloody history of fanaticism, murder in the name of God, torture in the name of love, crucifixion in the name of safety to the crown.
My God, why hast thou forsaken me?
He, too, sat in the Congress. The mild man with the scars in his hands and feet where the spikes went through. He was a consultant in the business at hand. Had he not died because the rulers of a realm denied free speech? Was he not nailed up on a cross between two thieves because his preachments were considered treason? He, the Son of God, was he not executed over an issue of the rights of man? Make no mistake about it. He was there. He sat beside James Madison and Elbridge Gerry and John Page in Federal Hall. Unseen he was, but voting. The men of Congress were collaborated with. They added up the gains and losses, and the brave words spoken, and the brave songs sung. They weighed the drawn and quartered flesh. They took into account the hemlock and the crucifix, the faggot and garrote. And then they framed amendments to the Constitution. Out of the agonies, out of the crisscross scars of all the human race, they made a Bill of Rights for their own people.